China is running out of cash. Not headlines, not slogans, cash. Local governments are selling assets, transferring operating rights, digging up old tax cases, raising hidden fees. National budget revenue is falling. Land sale income, the financial backbone of the system, is shrinking fast. And when a state built on constant growth suddenly can't generate enough new money, it doesn't stop. It feeds on itself. It pulls revenue forward. It converts future income into present survival. It squeezes the very businesses it needs to recover. This isn't a crash. It's something colder. China is eating itself alive, and the machinery is already in motion. To understand why China's system is devouring itself, we first need to understand the machine that built it, and why that machine is always one stumble away from turning on its creators. For 4 decades, the Chinese state ran one of the most aggressive developmental models in modern history. New cities, expressways, airports, rail lines, and infrastructure civilization advancing at a speed the world had never seen. And the unspoken deal was simple. Accept the political system, and in return, living standards rise. Every year, without exception. But here's what most people miss. That deal wasn't built on productivity or innovation alone. It was built on momentum, on the assumption that tomorrow's growth would always pay for today's debts, that next year's revenue would always cover this year's commitments, that property values would keep climbing forever, propping up household savings, bank balance sheets, and government budgets all at the same time. When growth is treated not just as desirable, but as essential, when the entire governing bargain depends on the assumption that next year will always be richer than this one, the moment it falters, well, that becomes more than an economic problem. It becomes a test of systemic survival. And the system had a fatal flaw that was hardwired into its foundations from the jump. Here's how China's fiscal machine actually worked. Local governments are responsible for delivering most public services: education, healthcare, housing, infrastructure, social programs. But they've never controlled enough tax revenue to pay for any of it. That gap between what local governments owe and what they actually earn has defined China's fiscal architecture for decades. So, how did they fill it? Well, with 2 mechanisms. Both were extraordinarily powerful during the boom years, but both now are broken. The first was land finance. Local authorities would sell land use rights to developers and pocket the cash. At its peak in 2021, land sale revenue hit a staggering 8.7 trillion yuan. A Stanford research brief found that in 2019, 38% of local government revenue came from land sales and land-backed financing alone. That's not a supplementary income stream. That's the engine room. The second was off-balance sheet borrowing through local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. These were state-owned entities that helped localities raise debt for infrastructure and urban development, without the borrowing ever appearing on official government books. The Reserve Bank of Australia traced how these vehicles became the go-to mechanism for funding public investment after China's 1994 tax reforms created a structural funding gap at the local level. And sitting at the very center of all of it, holding the entire structure together like a keystone, was the property sector. Not just a market, the hinge that simultaneously connected household wealth, developer balance sheets, bank collateral, and local government budgets. The IMF estimated that property-related activity accounted for about 20% of GDP during the decades of rapid growth. That's not just a big number. It means 1/5 of everything China produced was tied, directly or indirectly, to real estate. Chinese families had roughly 70% of their household wealth locked in property, compared to about 35% in the United States. For hundreds of millions of people, their apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was their pension, their savings account, their children's inheritance, and the proof that their system worked. Developers relied on pre-sales to fund construction. Banks relied on property as their primary collateral. And local governments relied on land sales to keep the lights on, the schools open, and the debt serviced. So when property slows, local budgets weaken. When local budgets weaken, LGFVs come under pressure. And when LGFVs weaken, infrastructure stalls and financial stability is threatened. When households watch their apartment values crater, well, they stop spending. This isn't a chain of isolated problems, it's a self-reinforcing feedback loop, and every link makes the next one worse. That loop just got triggered. Hard. China's property downturn didn't arrive as a single event. It unfolded like a sequence of detonations, each one exposing a deeper layer of vulnerability that the boom had papered over. In 2020, Beijing introduced the 3 red lines. rules designed to rein in developer leverage and cool an overheated market. The intent was reasonable, the timing was catastrophic. Instead of stabilizing the sector, the rules ripped the bandage off and exposed how deep the rot actually went. After a major developer defaulted in late 2021, confidence collapsed across the industry. Pre-sales dried up almost overnight. Construction halted. Developers burned through their working capital, and millions of Chinese families who had already paid for apartments watched their building sites go dark, their life savings frozen in concrete shells that may never be finished. The fiscal damage was immediate, and it hasn't stopped. By 2025, land use rights transfer revenue had fallen to 4.15 trillion yuan, down 14.7% from the year before, and more than half of its 2021 peak. That's 4 straight years of double-digit decline. Resident land sales revenue specifically plunged roughly 65% from peak level in 2020. And in January of 2026, the Ministry of Finance confirmed that national general public budget revenue fell 1.7% in 2025, the first outright contraction since the pandemic year in 2020. Now, these aren't abstract accounting categories. This is the cash that pays civil servant salaries, maintains roads, funds schools, and services local debt. When this money disappears, everything downstream starts to crack. Some provinces have already slashed government worker pay by double digits. Cities have dimmed streetlights and delayed infrastructure maintenance. The facade of stability is holding, but behind it, the machinery is running on fumes. And the debt wasn't standing still, it was compounding. In November of 2024, Beijing announced a 10 trillion yuan debt relief plan, raising the local government debt ceiling and directing new special purpose bonds toward replacing hidden debts.
The stated goal was to reduce hidden debt from 14.3 trillion yuan to 2.3 trillion by 2028.
But the IMF put total LGFV liabilities at a jaw-dropping 111% of GDP, a number that reveals just how deep the off-balance sheet exposure really runs. The engine hasn't just stalled, though. It's dragging the entire system backward. The mechanisms built to compensate for fiscal gaps have themselves become the biggest stress points in the system. But here's the thing about governments running out of money. They don't just accept it, they adapt, they improvise. And when the normal channels dry up, they start looking at everything around them. Every public asset, every operating right, every untapped fee as a potential lifeline. And in China's case, that improvisation has turned into something far more troubling than a budget shortfall. There's a phrase making the rounds in Chinese policy circles: eating next year's grain today. It perfectly describes what's happening across hundreds of local governments that can no longer balance their books through normal means. They're selling the future to survive the present. Local authorities have started auctioning off operating rights for everything they can monetize: school cafeteria franchises, public parking lots, sanitation management contracts, even funeral home concessions. One district auctioned rights to what officials called the low-altitude economy, essentially abstract rights involving drone logistics and airspace use. The winning bidder? A company owned by the same local government that ran the auction. Now, that's not revenue generation. That's a system moving money from one pocket to the other and calling it income. In other regions, officials have been accused of what Chinese commentators call turning stone into gold, repackaging low-value or non-commercial public resources as high-value assets to inflate their books. One locality assessed river sand and gravel reserves across 3 rivers at nearly $1 billion. Another province auctioned 20 years of desilting and disposal rights for over 800 million yuan to a state-owned enterprise that had been registered just 11 days before the sale. The central government is well aware of what's happening. In December of 2024, the National Development and Reform Commission issued explicit guidance warning against treating concession transfers as tools for selling assets or disguised local government financing. They specifically prohibited using auctions to select concessionaires for basic services like roadside parking and garbage collection, a direct acknowledgement that these mechanisms were being weaponized for short-term fiscal survival, not legitimate public service reform. Chinese policy analysts have warned against treating public resources as things to be sold once and for all, stressing the long-term governance risks of converting future flexibility into immediate cash. Even the IMF noted that authorities intend to accelerate asset sales as part of debt resolution, meaning that these assets are no longer instruments of development, they're fuel for survival. But if you think auctioning parking spots and funeral homes sounds desperate, wait until you hear what's actually happening to private businesses. because this is where China eating itself alive turns truly dangerous, and where the damage may be irreversible. Tax authorities have been digging through decades of corporate records, not for compliance, but for cash. In 2024, a liquor-related company was hit with a demand for roughly 85 million yuan in taxes allegedly owed since the 1990s. A chemical engineering firm faced a bill of nearly 100 million yuan. Another company halted production entirely after being ordered to pay 500 million yuan in back taxes. And a real estate developer told a reporter that his company had been forced to pay hefty taxes stretching back 2 decades, with the local government making sure nobody spoke about it to the media. As he put it, when the tiger is hungry, what do you think happens to the lamb? Whether those tax liabilities were legitimate, that's almost beside the point. The signal that they send is devastating. When a government retroactively enforces old tax claims during a fiscal emergency, well, businesses stop investing. They hoard cash. They delay hiring and expansion. They hedge against a system that no longer feels predictable or safe. And then there's what Chinese observers call ocean fishing. Local police crossing jurisdictional boundaries to confiscate funds under the guise of criminal investigations. In one widely reported case, police from a city in Guangdong province traveled over 900 kilometers to Wuhan, detaining 25 employees of a social media company and coerced its financial staff to transfer 300 million yuan to police-linked accounts. The allegation was that the company operated an illegal online casino. And this practice became so widespread that China's own state-run media called it a cancer damaging the business environment. The Ministry of Public Security demanded an end to it. A state council document issued in late 2024 announced strict measures to regulate enterprise-related inspections, explicitly forbidding profit-driven inspections and improper cross-regional enforcement that burdens firms. China's courts stepped up oversight of what they described as illicit cross-region and profit-driven law enforcement, seeking to protect business rights from enforcement overreach. Now, these were not minor policy tweaks. These are central authorities openly admitting that parts of the state apparatus have turned predatory. But acknowledging doesn't dissolve the incentive. As long as local budgets keep hemorrhaging cash, the pressure to extract won't stop, no matter what Beijing decrees from the top. And here's the trap that makes this so destructive. Every yuan squeezed from the private sector is a yuan that won't be invested, won't create jobs, and won't generate future tax revenue. Fiscal stress drives extraction. Extraction kills confidence. Dead confidence weakens growth. Weaker growth deepens fiscal stress. Round and round. The system is feeding on the very organs it needs to recover, and every rotation of the cycle leaves the patient a little weaker than the last. So why doesn't Beijing just stimulate its way out? Borrow more, build more, spend more. That playbook has worked for decades. Well, because the conditions that made that possible no longer exist. Let's begin with the demographics. In January of 2026, the National Bureau of Statistics reported that China's population fell by 3.39 million in 2025, the steepest peacetime annual decline on record. Only 7.92 million babies were born. That's down 17% from the year before, the lowest figure since records began in 1949. One prominent demographer noted the 2025 birth count was roughly equivalent to levels last seen in 1738, when China's total population was just 150 million. Meanwhile, 11.31 million people died. That's the highest annual death toll in over 5 decades. Over 323 million Chinese are now aged 60 or above. That's 23% of the entire population. By 2035, that number is projected to reach 40 million, roughly equal to the combined populations of the United States and Italy. An aging society doesn't just slow growth, it increases the cost of everything. Pensions, healthcare, elder care, while the workforce that funds it all keeps shrinking year after year. In the 1980s, 8 working-age Chinese supported each retiree. And today, it's closer to 4. And by the mid-2030s, it'll be 2. The math doesn't work. And China can't immigrate its way out of the problem like the way the US or Canada can. Its system isn't built for that. And the appeal simply isn't there. And the young people who are supposed to carry that burden, they can't find work. The urban unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds, excluding students, sat at 16.5% as of December of 2025. That's the revised number, by the way. And there's a story behind that revision. China's Statistics Bureau suspended publication of youth unemployment data entirely in June 2023, right after its rate hit a record 21.3% and became an international embarrassment. When they resumed months later, they had quietly changed the methodology to exclude students from the count. Now, even under the new, more flattering formula, the rate still spiked to 18.9% in August of 2025, after a record 12.2 million university graduates flooded the job market all at once. A generation trained for white-collar careers is now delivering food and working factory floors, if they can find work at all. Then there's the property sector itself. The IMF has argued that China isn't transitioning from a boom to a mild slowdown. It's heading toward a new normal, in which demand for new housing is structurally weaker due to demographics, urbanization patterns, and massive excess inventory. Real estate development investment fell nearly 14% in the first 3 quarters of 2025 alone, and prices in most major cities are still sliding. The fiscal machine, built on continuous land transactions and rising developer confidence, cannot simply be restarted with a single round of stimulus. The fundamental demand that powered it for decades, that's no longer there. The World Bank reached a complementary conclusion. Durable improvement in household consumption requires deep structural reform, particularly reforms that give local governments sustainable, stable revenue sources instead of forcing them to rely on volatile, land-linked funding that evaporates the moment that the property cycle turns. And here's what ties all of this together into something truly alarming. The demographic decline means fewer workers and more retirees. Fewer workers means less tax revenue. Less tax revenue means tighter local budgets. Tighter budgets mean more extraction from businesses. More extraction means less investment and fewer jobs. And fewer jobs, well, that means young people spend less, they marry less, and have even fewer children, which accelerates the demographic decline. Every thread in this crisis connects to every other thread, and they're all pulling in the same direction. The tools that built the boom are now trapped by the costs that they created. Debt is heavier, property is weaker, the population is older and shrinking faster than anyone projected, and confidence in the market, in the government's promises, in the future itself, is more brittle than at any point in the reform era. Which brings us back to the central question of this entire story. What happens when a system built on endless growth can no longer grow fast enough to sustain itself? Well, it doesn't explode. It does something quieter, and in many ways, more dangerous. It starts converting its own future into short-term survival, selling rights, securitizing cash flows, raiding private sector liquidity, pulling revenue forward from years that haven't arrived yet, dismantling long-term capacity to maintain the illusion of short-term solvency. China's leadership isn't blind to the danger. The debt relief packages, the warnings against predatory enforcement, the attempts to put a floor under the property market, all of it shows a government that understands the spiral that it's caught in. But understanding and escaping are not the same thing. The structural mismatch between local obligations and local revenues hasn't been resolved. The property sector hasn't recovered. The demographic trajectory has only accelerated further in the wrong direction. And the incentives driving local officials to extract, auction, and squeeze are as powerful today as they were a year ago. Every concession right sold today is flexibility lost tomorrow. Every retroactive tax raid is a business that won't expand next quarter. Every yuan pulled forward is a yuan that won't be there when the next crisis hits. This is what cannibalization looks like in a modern economy. Not famine, not war, just a slow grinding conversion of long-term capacity into short-term survival. Until the storehouse is thinner, the options are fewer, and the future costs, well, more than the present can afford. And the implications stretch far beyond China's borders. When the world's second-largest economy enters a structural fiscal crisis, the ripple effects touch every supply chain, every commodity market, every country that depends on Chinese demand. The world bet heavy on China's rise. Nobody has a plan for what happens when the machines that powered it start feeding on itself. The question is no longer whether China's system is under stress. That debate is settled. The real question is whether Beijing can break the loop before the loop breaks the system. Can China reinvent its fiscal architecture before local governments strip mine everything that's left? Can it rebuild private sector confidence while the enforcement apparatus still runs on survival instincts? Can it build a consumer-driven economy with a shrinking, aging population and a generation of young people who've given up looking for careers that match their degrees? Or has the machinery of growth already become the machinery of extraction? with no off switch in sight. Let us know what you think in the comments, and if this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the stories shaping the future of global power, they don't wait for anyone.